You're getting ready for work on a typical Tuesday morning in May 2001. You kiss your husband goodbye, wave to your neighbors, and head to catch your usual bus into Washington, D.C. But you never make it to the office. Instead, hours later, your husband and your boss will discover your lifeless body in your own bedroom, beaten so brutally that blood is splattered across multiple rooms of your home. But here's where this case gets absolutely chilling. The killer wasn't some random stranger who broke in during the night. It wasn't a burglar gone wrong or a crime of opportunity. No, the person who murdered 50-year-old Leslie Prieur in her Chevy Chase home had sat at her dinner table. He had laughed at her husband's jokes. He had gone on family vacations with them. He had been welcomed into their home for 5 years as their daughter's boyfriend. And for 23 years, he walked free while a family grieved, never knowing that the monster they were looking for had been hiding in plain sight all along. My name is your host, and today we're diving deep into one of the most shocking cold case breakthroughs in Maryland history. A case where cutting-edge forensic genetic genealogy finally unmasked a killer who thought he had committed the perfect crime. This is the story of Leslie Prieur and how her daughter's ex-boyfriend, Eugene Theodore Gligor, got away with murder for over 2 decades. Leslie Ann Jennings was born in October 1951 in Quonset Point, Rhode Island, one of 8 siblings in a military family. Those who knew her described Leslie as sensitive, kind, and beautiful, both inside and out. After moving to Pensacola, Florida in 1963, Leslie would eventually attend the University of Florida, where she studied journalism and met Carl Prieur, who went by Sandy. The couple married in 1974 and 3 years later welcomed their daughter Lauren. In 1982, the Prieurs moved north to Chevy Chase, Maryland, right on the border of Washington, D.C. For nearly 20 years, they built what everyone considered the perfect family life. Leslie worked in downtown D.C., Sandy had his career, and Lauren grew up in their tight-knit community. But perfection, as we know in the true crime world, is often just an illusion. Enter Eugene Theodore Gligor, a neighborhood kid who seemed harmless enough. He and Lauren had grown up in the same area, attended the same high school, and when Lauren turned 15, they began dating. What started as a teenage romance would span 5 years, with Eugene becoming deeply embedded in the Prieur family fabric. Here's what makes this case so disturbing. Eugene wasn't just Lauren's boyfriend. He was practically a son to Leslie and Sandy. He joined them on family trips, played board games at their kitchen table, and Leslie had grown genuinely fond of this young man who seemed to love her daughter. Sandy, however, always felt something was off about Eugene. He repeatedly warned Lauren that there was something not quite right about her boyfriend, though he could never put his finger on exactly what. Lauren would later tell the Washington Post that Eugene had never shown any signs of violence during their relationship. But as we'll see, sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who hide in plain sight, wearing the mask of normalcy. By 1998, Lauren and Eugene had broken up. She was moving on with her life, and Eugene seemed to fade into the background. For 3 years there was no contact between them. Lauren was building her future, and Eugene appeared to be just a memory from her past. Then came May 2nd, 2001, a date that would forever shatter the Prieur family's world. That Tuesday morning started like any other. Sandy left for work around 7:30, with Leslie getting ready for her job in downtown Washington, D.C. She should have caught her usual bus and been at the office within an hour. But Leslie Prieur never made it to work that day. When Leslie failed to show up at her office, her boss Brett became concerned. Leslie wasn't the type to be late without calling, and she wasn't answering her phone. Brett began calling Leslie's emergency contacts, her husband Sandy and daughter Lauren, but both were surprised to hear that Leslie hadn't made it to work. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Sandy and Brett decided to meet at the Drummond Avenue house to check on Leslie. What they discovered when they arrived around 11:30 that morning would haunt them forever. The house was eerily quiet. Too quiet. When they entered, they found what can only be described as a scene from a nightmare. Blood was splattered and smeared across multiple rooms, painting the walls and floors in a grotesque tableau of violence. A table had been knocked over in the struggle. A rug had been moved from the foyer into the living room, soaked with blood. And upstairs, in her own bedroom, they found Leslie Prior. She had been beaten to death with such brutality that investigators would later describe it as one of the most violent crime scenes they had encountered. This wasn't a quick killing. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was personal. This was rage unleashed in its most primal form. Brett immediately called 911, and both men were instructed to leave the house and wait for police. When Montgomery County detectives arrived, they found what one investigator would later call a pretty brutal crime scene with a lot of blood. But here's the crucial detail that would eventually crack this case wide open 23 years later. Leslie Prior didn't go down without a fight. DNA evidence recovered from under her fingernails showed she had struggled with her attacker. She had fought for her life, and in doing so, she had unknowingly collected the genetic evidence that would one day bring her killer to justice. The initial investigation was thorough. Detectives collected DNA evidence from the scene, interviewed family members, friends, and associates. They compiled lists of potential suspects, including men in Leslie's life who might have had access to the house or motive to harm her. Lauren provided investigators with a list of people who had been in their lives, including her ex-boyfriend, Eugene Gleiger. His name went into the case file, but here's the critical mistake that cost 23 years of justice. While other men on the suspect list were interviewed and swabbed for DNA, Eugene Gleiger somehow slipped through the cracks. He was never properly questioned, never swabbed, never thoroughly investigated. If investigators had collected Eugene's DNA in 2001, Leslie Prior's murder would have been solved immediately. Her husband Sandy, who died in 2017, would have lived to see justice served. The family's decades of anguish could have been avoided. But Eugene Gleiger got lucky. Or so he thought. The case went cold. Years turned into decades. The Montgomery County Police Department's cold case unit kept the file active, but with no new leads and DNA technology still in its infancy compared to today's capabilities, the case seemed destined to remain unsolved. Eugene Gleiger moved on with his life. He relocated to Washington, D.C., living just miles from the scene of his crime. For over 20 years, he walked the same streets, lived in the same area, probably passed members of the Prior family without them ever knowing they were looking at their mother's killer. But in the true crime world, we know that justice might be delayed, but it's not always denied. And sometimes, it takes a revolutionary breakthrough in forensic science to finally catch a killer who thought he was untouchable. If you're finding this case as compelling as I am, and you want to see more deep dives into cold cases that have finally been solved through modern investigative techniques, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. These stories need to be told, and your support helps us bring justice to light even decades after the fact. In September 2022, 21 years after Leslie Prior's murder, investigators made a decision that would change everything. They took blood evidence from the original crime scene and sent it to Othram Incor's Labs, a Texas-based forensics company specializing in forensic genetic genealogy analysis. Now, let me explain why this was such a game-changer. Traditional DNA analysis can only identify a suspect if their DNA is already in the CODIS database, the national DNA database containing profiles from convicted offenders. But Eugene Gleiger had never been arrested for any crimes that would have required his DNA to be entered into CODIS. He was what investigators call a ghost, someone whose genetic profile existed but wasn't in any criminal database. Forensic genetic genealogy changes the game entirely. This technique takes unknown DNA from a crime scene and uses it to build family trees through publicly accessible genealogy websites like Family Tree DNA and GED Match. It's the same technology that caught the Golden State Killer and has revolutionized cold case investigations across the country. But here's what makes the Leslie Prior case historically significant. This would be the first time in Maryland state history that familial DNA was used to solve a cold case murder. The Prieur family was about to become pioneers in the fight for justice through science. The genetic genealogy analysis began producing results that must have sent chills down the investigators' spines. The DNA profile from Leslie's crime scene was generating matches on Family Tree DNA's database, and a pattern was emerging. Multiple shared DNA connections were pointing toward one particular surname that kept appearing in the family trees: Gligor. When investigators saw that name emerge from the genetic genealogy, they immediately went back to their original case files from 2001. And there it was. Eugene Theodore Gligor's name, provided by Lauren Prieur as someone who had been in their lives, sitting in a file that had been gathering dust for over 2 decades. But it gets even more incredible. On June 4, 2024, investigators were reviewing old tips and came across something that made their blood run cold. A tip dated January 30, 2002, almost exactly 9 months after Leslie's murder. It was from one of Eugene's neighbors, suggesting that Lauren Prieur's boyfriend might be connected to the homicide. Think about that for a moment. In 2002, someone in Eugene's neighborhood was suspicious enough about him to call in a tip connecting him to Leslie's murder. But that tip somehow got buried in the avalanche of information that comes with any major investigation. If that tip had been properly followed up on in 2002, combined with a DNA swab, this case would have been closed 22 years ago. Eugene Gligor had been hiding in plain sight, protected by bureaucratic oversight and investigative mistakes. But now, science and persistence were about to catch up with him. On June 9, 2024, undercover Montgomery County detectives began what can only be described as one of the most nerve-wracking surveillance operations of their careers. They followed Eugene Gligor to Washington Dulles International Airport, watching and waiting for the perfect moment to collect what they needed. They watched as Eugene purchased a bottle of water, drank from it, and then casually tossed it into a nearby trash can. The moment he walked away, detectives swooped in and collected that discarded bottle. It was sent immediately for DNA testing. The results came back as a perfect match to the DNA recovered from Leslie Prieur's crime scene 23 years earlier. On June 18, 2024, U.S. Marshals arrested 44-year-old Eugene Theodore Gligor and charged him with first-degree murder in the death of Leslie Prieur. When Lauren Prieur learned of the arrest, her reaction was one of complete shock. This was someone who had been part of her family, someone she had loved, someone who had shared holidays and vacations with them. The betrayal was almost incomprehensible. Never in a million years would we think that one of our people could hurt my mom like that, Lauren told reporters. The pain in her voice was evident, the disbelief palpable. But questions immediately began swirling through the true crime community and online sleuths. Why had Eugene killed Leslie? What was his motive? They had been broken up for 3 years, by 2001. As far as anyone knew, there was no ongoing conflict between Eugene and the Prieur family. Here's where the theories and speculations from crime enthusiasts online become particularly interesting. Some suggest that Eugene may have had an unhealthy obsession with Lauren that extended beyond their breakup. Perhaps he couldn't accept that their relationship was truly over, and Leslie represented an obstacle or a symbol of his rejection. Others theorize that there may have been some kind of confrontation that day. Maybe Eugene went to the house looking for Lauren, only to encounter Leslie alone. Perhaps Leslie said something that triggered a violent rage, or maybe she threatened to call police if he didn't leave Lauren alone. There's also speculation that Eugene may have been stalking the family, learning their routines, and that May the 2nd wasn't a random visit, but a planned attack. The brutality of the crime suggests deep-seated anger and resentment that had been building for years. Some online investigators have pointed out that Eugene and his mother moved out of the neighborhood in August or September 2001, just a few months after Leslie's murder. Was this a coincidence, or was Eugene trying to distance himself from the crime scene and potential scrutiny? During his interrogation, police tried desperately to understand his motive. Video footage shows Eugene struggling to maintain his composure when confronted with the DNA evidence. "Honey, your DNA was in the crime scene," one investigator told him. What followed wasn't exactly a confession, but it wasn't a denial either. Eugene's inability to provide a coherent explanation for why his DNA was at the crime scene only deepened the mystery of his motivation. Was this a crime of passion, a planned attack, or something else entirely? On May 7, 2025, Eugene Theodore Gligor appeared in a Montgomery County courtroom and pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in the death of Leslie Prieur. The plea deal meant he would face up to 30 years in prison rather than risk a first-degree murder conviction that could have resulted in life without parole. Montgomery County State's Attorney John McCarthy explained that proving premeditation in a case this old would have been extremely difficult. "It's very hard to establish that a person necessarily premeditated the killing," McCarthy said. "This was a blunt force trauma case with multiple injuries." The Prieur family chose not to speak publicly on the day of the plea, but McCarthy conveyed their feelings of finally achieving justice. "I think Lauren, in particular, just wanted me to mention that her mother was a spectacular, loving, wonderful person, loved by family and friends." Several of Leslie's siblings were expected to testify at Eugene's sentencing hearing, scheduled for August 28, 2025, giving them the opportunity to finally confront the man who had stolen their sister from them over 2 decades earlier. As we reach the end of this incredible journey from cold case to justice, it's worth reflecting on what the Leslie Prieur case teaches us about the evolution of criminal investigation. This case represents a perfect storm of old-fashioned detective work, cutting-edge science, and the persistence of investigators who refuse to let a case go unsolved. The breakthrough in genetic genealogy that solved this case is now being applied to thousands of cold cases across the country. Killers who thought they had escaped justice are being caught decades after their crimes. Families who had given up hope are finally getting answers. But perhaps most importantly, the Leslie Prieur case reminds us that in the true crime world, there's no such thing as a perfect murder. Evidence endures, science advances, and justice, while sometimes delayed, has a way of eventually finding its mark. If this deep dive into the Leslie Prieur case has shown you the incredible power of modern forensic investigation, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. These stories of justice, delayed but not denied, need to be told, and your engagement helps us continue bringing these important cases to light. Eugene Gligor may have thought he got away with murder for 23 years, but Leslie Prieur's final act of defiance, fighting back and collecting his DNA under her fingernails, ensured that justice would eventually be served. Sometimes the victims solve their own cases, even from beyond the grave. That's the power of evidence, the persistence of investigators, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and daughter that transcended even death itself.